The worst part was not the cold. It was the silence that came before it. That particular, hollow quiet of a room where someone has just stopped pretending to love you. Willa had known something was wrong for 17 days. She had counted them, one by one, the way a person counts steps on a staircase in the dark. Not because counting helps, but because it is the only thing left to do when moving forward feels like falling. 17 days since Lord Edric had stopped reaching for her hand at the evening table. 17 days since the warmth had drained from his voice, slowly, the way heat leaves a stone after the fire dies. She had told herself it was grief. His father had been ill. The harvest had gone poorly. The border tensions with the northern reaches were mounting. She had told herself many things. She had been very good at telling herself things. The great hall of Edenmore was dressed for the betrothal celebration. Candles burned in iron chandeliers overhead, casting gold across the long tables, across the faces of the lords and ladies who had come from 3 neighboring holds to witness the formal announcement. Willa stood near the far window in a gown of deep blue linen, her dark hair braided and pinned at the base of her neck, her hands folded in front of her with a stillness she had practiced since childhood. She looked composed. She always looked composed. She smelled the roses before she understood what they meant. Not her roses. She had brought white freesias from her mother's estate, modest, honest flowers, the kind that did not try to impress. These were red roses, hothouse roses, the kind that cost a small fortune in the middle of autumn, the kind a man brought for a woman he wanted to astonish. The scent drifted from the corridor beyond the hall's east door, faint and unmistakable, tangled with something else, a perfume she recognized. Lady Sephine's perfume. Lady Sephine, who was supposed to be recovering from a fever in the south wing. Willa set down her cup. She moved without thinking, following the scent, the way her instincts had always guided her when her mind was too tired to argue. Down the corridor, past the tapestries of old hunts and older wars, past the servants' alcove, toward the small receiving room that Edric used for private counsel. The door was not fully closed. Through the gap, she could hear voices, low, unhurried, intimate in the way that only people who have been intimate for a long time can sound. She pushed the door open. She would replay this moment for a long time afterward, not because she wanted to, but because the mind is cruel about the things it chooses to keep. Edric stood with his back to the door, one hand resting on Sephine's waist, the red roses lying across the writing table beside them. He was speaking into her hair. She was laughing softly, her fingers curled against his chest. They were not simply close. They were familiar. They were settled. This was not a stolen moment. This was a habit. Sephine saw Willa first. She did not look ashamed. That was the part that landed like a blow to the sternum, the absence of shame on that woman's face. There was something almost like satisfaction in it, the slow, deliberate expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Edric turned. He did not reach for Willa. He did not step toward her. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes moving over her with the careful assessment of a man calculating what this inconvenience would cost him. Inconvenience. That was the word her mind produced, and once it appeared, she could not make it leave. "Willa," he said. I'm sorry. It isn't what you think. Just her name, flat and tired, as if she were the one who had done something exhausting. She turned and walked away. She walked back through the corridor with her hands still folded and her spine still straight, because the body sometimes goes on performing dignity long after the person inside has shattered. She walked back into the hall, past the candles and the guests and the tables dressed for a celebration that no longer made sense, and she went up the stairs to the chamber that had been given to her as Edric's promised mate, and she closed the door behind her. For exactly 1 minute, she stood very still. Then she began to pack. She did not take much. A travel cloak, charcoal wool with a deep hood, her small leather satchel, worn at the strap from years of use. The letter her brother Cohen had sent her 2 months ago from the Eastern Academy. She kept it folded inside her bodice because his handwriting made her feel less alone. Her mother's ring, which she wore on a cord rather than a finger because it was too large and had been too large since the day her mother placed it in her 7-year-old hands and told her to keep it safe. A change of linen, the small knife she carried without ever telling anyone she carried it. She left the blue gown on the chair. She left the betrothal gift Edric had given her, a silver comb she had never particularly wanted, on the writing table. She left everything that had belonged to the life she had been building here. She was at the servants' entrance when Marta found her. Marta was 61 years old, wide-shouldered, gray-braided, and had been Willa's nurse until Willa was 12, and her family's head housekeeper until the estate was sold to pay debts. She had followed Willa to Edenmore as a lady's companion, because Marta had never once in Willa's memory done anything for any reason other than that she had decided it was right. She took one look at Willa's face and the traveling cloak, and said nothing for a moment. Then she pressed a small purse of coins into Willa's hand. "I've been keeping this," Marta said quietly, "in case you ever needed to leave quickly." Willa stared at the purse, her throat tightened. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough." Marta's expression was not pitying. It was precise and warm and sorrowful in the specific way of someone who loves another person enough to let them be angry later. "The eastern road will be watched by morning. Take the forest path through Dunmore. There's an inn at the crossroads. Tell the keeper you're Berta's niece. He'll give you a room without questions." "You prepared for this," Willa said. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to wonder. "I prepared for what was possible." Marta pulled the hood of Willa's cloak up herself, with the same brisk tenderness she had used to fasten cloaks 20 years ago. "Go, girl. Go before that man decides your silence is a problem worth managing." The words landed oddly, with more weight than Willa had time to examine. She embraced Marta once, briefly, with the kind of fierceness that tries to say everything there is no time to say, and then she went out into the night. The cold hit her immediately. A sharp, wet cold that tasted of pine sap and coming rain. The moon was behind clouds. The grounds of Edenmore were lit at the main gates and the stable yard, but the eastern garden wall had no torches, and Willa moved along it in darkness, her boots finding the gravel path by memory. She had walked it every evening for 8 months. She knew every uneven stone. She was nearly to the gap in the wall, a place where the old mortar had crumbled and no one had seen fit to repair it. When she heard the voices, she stopped. 2 men, speaking near the garden's iron bench. She recognized Lord Hadwin's voice, Edric's cousin, a man with a wide smile and small eyes who had always made her feel observed in an unpleasant way. The other voice she did not know, lower, clipped, the accent of someone from farther north. "Needs to happen before she speaks to anyone with standing," Hadwin was saying. "Once the betrothal is formally dissolved, she can claim a portion of the estate. Her mother's dowry reverts." "Then, don't dissolve it formally," the other voice said. "An accident. The forest at night. These things happen." Silence. "She has no family left with influence," Hadwin continued. "The brother is at the academy. By the time word reaches him, then we move quickly." Willa did not move. She was not certain she was breathing. The garden bench was 12 feet from where she stood in the shadow of the wall, and she was absolutely certain that if either man turned, they would see her. She pressed herself against the cold stone and waited, counting her heartbeats, willing them slower. The men moved away toward the house. She went through the gap in the wall at a run. The Dunmore forest was dense and dark, and smelled of rain-wet earth and something sharper beneath it. A mineral scent, cold and clean, the kind that meant the ground was being turned by roots older than the keep she had just fled. She ran until she couldn't, then walked, then ran again when the sound of hoofbeats rose somewhere behind her on the road. The clouds broke briefly. In the moonlight, The trees cast long shadows across the path, and Willa's breath came in pale clouds, and she thought of nothing except the next step, and the next, and the next. She did not see the shape until she nearly ran into it. She stopped hard, one hand seizing a tree branch for balance, and looked up. A man stood in the middle of the path. He was very tall, taller than she had expected a person to simply be, dressed in a dark riding cloak with no insignia she could immediately read, his hood down despite the cold, his face turned slightly toward the sound of the distant hoofbeats. He had not heard her, or he had heard her, and had decided not to react yet. She could not tell which, and the inability to tell frightened her more than the man himself. Then he turned. His eyes found her immediately. Gray, steady, carrying the particular quality of someone who is always the calmest person in any room, not because nothing troubles him, but because he has decided that panic is a resource he cannot afford to waste. He looked at her traveling cloak, her loose braid, the way she was gripping the branch, the direction she had come from. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're running from something." Not a question. Willa lifted her chin. "That is not your concern." He looked at her for a moment longer with those level gray eyes. Then he stepped aside, clearing the path ahead of her. "The crossroads is another mile," he said. "The ground drops after the oak split. Watch your footing." She stared at him. He said nothing else. He simply waited, with the unhurried patience of a man who had all night and no particular place to be, which she did not believe for a moment, but which he made entirely convincing. She walked past him. She did not thank him. She was not certain she was capable of gratitude yet. But she felt his gaze on her back for a long time after she had passed, steady and quiet, like a hand held just above the shoulder. Present, but not pressing. She did not know his name. She did not know yet what it would cost her to learn it. The inn at the crossroads was called the Wren and Wheel, and it smelled of tallow candles, barley soup, and the particular staleness of a building that had housed too many travelers to bother pretending it was comfortable. Willa pushed through the low door and stood for a moment in the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior. The keeper was a broad man with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. He looked up from the counter with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had learned long ago that most people who arrived at his inn after dark were either running from something or looking for something, and that neither category required his sympathy. "I'm Berta's niece," Willa said quietly. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, the closing of a door that had been standing open. He reached beneath the counter and produced a key on a wooden peg. "Room at the back," he said. "No window facing the road. Breakfast is porridge and whatever's left of the bread. Water's in the pitcher. Don't open the door for anyone who knocks after the candles are snuffed downstairs." "Thank you," Willa said. He looked at her for a moment with something that might, in a different man, have been concern. Then he went back to wiping the counter. The room was small and cold, and smelled of lye soap and old wool blankets, and Willa had never been more grateful for anything in her life. She barred the door, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and allowed herself, for the first time since the garden wall, to stop moving. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. The fine tremor in her fingers, the dirt along the edge of her right palm, where she had caught herself against a root in the dark forest. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed, slowly, through her nose, the way Marta had taught her when she was 9 years old, and prone to the kind of storms that came from feeling too much, without knowing what to do with it. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. She had not cried. She did not cry now. What she felt was not grief, not yet. Grief required a period of believing in something, and she was no longer certain how much of the last 8 months she had actually believed in, or how much she had simply been very determined to. She thought about Cohen. Her brother was 23, younger than her by 2 years, and had gone to the Eastern Academy on a scholarship that had taken him 3 attempts to earn. He had written to her every month without fail, long, slightly disorganized letters, full of observations about his studies and small jokes about the other scholars and questions about whether she was eating properly and sleeping enough, because Cohen had always worried about her in the quiet, consistent way of someone who knew her well enough to know what she hid. His last letter had arrived 6 weeks ago. She had not written back with the full truth, because she had not yet admitted the full truth to herself. She wished, with a sharpness that surprised her, that he were here. The brother is at the academy. By the time word reaches him. She sat up straighter on the bed. Hadwin had mentioned Cohen. Not as a detail. Not as context. As a calculation. By the time word reaches him. As if Cohen's distance were a specific advantage they were accounting for in whatever plan they had been discussing. That meant they had thought about him. That meant they had considered the possibility that he might become a problem. That meant Cohen was not safe simply because he was far away. Willa pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where the letter was folded against her skin, and thought very carefully. She needed to warn him. She needed to reach him before anyone from Edenmore could. The academy was a 10-day ride east through stable roads, which meant 2 weeks minimum if the roads had muddied with autumn rain, which they had. She had perhaps half the coins she would need for that journey. A knife, a travel cloak, and no horse. She also had, she reminded herself, the habit of solving problems with what she had rather than mourning what she didn't. She had just begun to work through the possibilities when she heard it. A voice in the common room below, low and unhurried, talking to the keeper. She could not make out the words through the floor, but the cadence was familiar. A particular steadiness, a way of speaking that did not rise or hurry regardless of what it was saying. She had heard exactly that voice once before, 40 minutes ago, in a dark forest path. She was at the barred door before she had consciously decided to move. She stood with her hand on the bar for a long moment, listening. The floorboards of the common room creaked in a pattern that suggested someone crossing toward the stairs. Then footsteps on the wooden steps. Unhurried even. Not the heavy tread of a man trying to be intimidating, but not cautious either. The footsteps of someone who had decided where he was going and saw no reason to rush or hide the fact. They stopped outside her door. A single knock. Not urgent, not soft either. A knock that said, "I know you're awake and I know you heard me coming, and I would rather speak to you directly than have you spend the night wondering." Willa thought of the keeper's instructions. Don't open the door for anyone who knocks after the candles are snuffed downstairs. Then she looked down at the thin line of light still visible under the door and reasoned that the candles were not yet snuffed, which was either sound logic or the kind of reasoning a desperate person produces to justify what they already want to do. She lifted the bar. She did not open the door fully. She kept one hand on the frame and let it swing just enough to see. He had not changed in the 40 minutes since the forest. Still the dark riding cloak, still the gray eyes, still that quality of absolute composure that she found equally reassuring and irritating. He was holding, somewhat unexpectedly, a small wooden bowl of soup. "You didn't eat," he said. She stared at the soup, then at him. "You followed me," she said. "I was already going to the crossroads." He met her eyes without the flinching quality of someone caught doing something they should not have been doing. "I asked the keeper to add a meal to your room. He declined on the grounds that he does not run a service inn." A pause. "I was persuasive. You had no way of knowing I hadn't eaten. You've been running through a forest in the dark for the better part of an hour after what was clearly a significant shock. The probability was reasonable." He held the bowl slightly forward, an offering, not an imposition. "I'm not going to come in. I only wanted to ensure you had this." Willa looked at him for a long moment. In the narrow hallway light, She could see more clearly what the forest dark had only suggested. The set of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he held himself with the specific ease of a man who had been trained in authority from the time he was old enough to understand what it was. There was nothing soft about him, but there was also nothing threatening in the way he was standing, nothing that pushed against her space or her silence. She took the bowl. "Who are you?" she asked. Something moved in his expression, a flicker of consideration, as if he were deciding something. Then he said without particular ceremony, "Tristan." Just the name, nothing else. She waited. He did not elaborate. "Tristan," she repeated slowly, testing it, running it against every name she had memorized at Edenmore. The lords, the envoys, the neighboring alphas whose territories bordered Edric's lands. It snagged on something half-remembered from a conversation she had been on the periphery of, a conversation between Edric and Hadwin 3 months ago that she had caught only fragments of because she had been leaving a room, not entering it. The northern reaches, the king's envoy, the king himself, if the rumors. Her fingers tightened on the bowl. "You're not an envoy," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her steadily. "No. The northern reaches." She was working through it even as she said it. The delegation that was supposed to arrive at Edenmore this week for the territorial negotiations. Edric mentioned it. He said... She stopped. Something cold was settling into place. He said the Alpha King was coming himself. He said it was the first time in 11 years that the king had left his seat. Tristan said nothing. He did not confirm or deny. He simply stood there with those gray eyes and that composed silence, and the confirmation was in the lack of denial, which she understood perfectly. Willa had been raised to curtsy in the presence of royalty. Her mother had drilled it into her from early childhood. The correct depth, the angle of the head, the placement of the hands. She did not curtsy now. She was holding a bowl of soup in a narrow inn corridor at what she estimated was close to midnight, wearing a travel cloak over a gown she had been too hurried to change. And she had just discovered that the man who had given her directions through a dark forest and brought her a meal and knocked on her door without demanding anything was the most powerful alpha in the northern reaches. She said, "Why? Well, not why are you here, or why did you follow me, or why did you bring me soup?" Just the single word, carrying all of those questions at once. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you walked out of that forest alone, at night, with the look of someone who had just discovered something they couldn't unhear. And because whatever is happening at Edenmore tonight has already cost you enough without adding hunger to it." It was not the answer she had expected. She had expected calculation. An Alpha King did not appear at Crossroads Inns without purpose, without strategy, without something he needed. She had expected the explanation to reveal a ledger, some reason she was useful to him, some angle she had not yet identified. Instead, he had said without adding hunger to it. As if the soup were simply the soup. As if her discomfort had mattered to him on its own terms, without attachment to anything larger. She did not know what to do with that. "Lord Hadwin intends to have me killed," she said. The words came out very flat and clear, without the trembling she might have expected. Naming the thing made it smaller, or at least more manageable. "I heard him speaking in the garden with someone I didn't recognize. They said it needed to happen before I could speak to anyone with standing. They mentioned my brother." Tristan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, a sharpening, a going still, the quality of a man who has just filed something in a category that will require his attention shortly. "Is your brother in danger?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But they calculated around him. That means they've thought about him." He nodded once, with the slow precision of someone who is not just hearing information, but doing something with it. "Eat the soup," he said. "Sleep. Don't open the door again tonight." He held her gaze for just a moment longer. "You're safe here." She almost told him she didn't need him to tell her she was safe. She almost said that she was perfectly capable of managing her own safety, which was clearly not yet true, but had always been her instinct to claim. Instead, she looked at him, this man who had stepped out of a forest path and brought her soup and confirmed he was a king without making it feel like a weapon, and said nothing. He turned and walked back down the corridor. She closed the door, barred it. She ate the soup standing in the middle of the cold room, and it was the best thing she had tasted in months, which had nothing to do with the soup. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses. Not one or two, many, the heavy, organized rhythm of a coordinated group, moving with purpose rather than haste. Willa was on her feet before she was fully conscious, her hand finding the knife at her belt with the automatic reach of someone who had gone to sleep, already half-braced for exactly this. She crossed to the door, pressed her ear against the wood, and listened. The common room below was not silent. She could hear the keeper's voice, low and controlled, and at least two other voices she did not recognize. Then a third voice, a woman's, brisk and authoritative, issuing what sounded like instructions about horses and water and something she couldn't fully distinguish. Not Edenmore's people. The accents were different, northern. She unbarred the door carefully and opened it just enough. In the corridor stood a young woman of perhaps 25, compact and sharp-eyed, dressed in the dark practical clothing of someone who rode for function rather than appearance. She had a short braid over one shoulder and the particular posture of someone trained in close combat, weight slightly forward, hands easy at her sides. When she saw the door open, she did not reach for the short blade at her hip. She simply looked at Willa with a direct, assessing gaze and said, "Lady Willa, I'm Petra. I serve the king. He sent me to bring you down when you were ready, not before." Willa studied her for a moment. "He told you my name." "He told me several things," Petra said, without further elaboration, which Willa recognized as the specific loyalty of someone who considered discretion a form of respect. "Give me a moment," Willa said. She closed the door, splashed water from the pitcher on her face, retightened her braid with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped needing a mirror for it, and checked that the letter from Cohen was still folded against her sternum. Then she opened the door again and followed Petra downstairs. The common room had been transformed in the particular way that power transforms spaces, not by any change in the furniture or the light, but by the quality of attention in it. 4 men in dark riding clothes stood at intervals that were not casual, each one positioned with a soldier's unconscious geometry. The keeper stood behind his counter with the look of a man who had decided that whatever was happening in his inn this morning was entirely above his station and was proceeding accordingly. Tristan stood near the hearth. He had changed from last night, or perhaps he had not slept at all, and had simply added a dark outer coat over the riding clothes, because the coat had the quality of a garment put on quickly rather than chosen. He was holding a folded piece of parchment, reading it with the focused stillness of a man processing something significant, and he did not look up immediately when Willa descended the stairs. She was aware, with a sharpness she would rather not have felt, that the not looking up was itself deliberate, that he was giving her the gift of entering a room without being watched, without having to perform composure for an audience that included him. She crossed to stand near the hearth, not beside him, but not at a distance either, and waited. He folded the parchment and looked up. "Edenmore sent riders north at midnight," he said, without preamble. 3 of them, moving fast. "My men intercepted one on the Greywood Road." Willa absorbed this. What was he carrying? Tristan held up the parchment. She reached for it, and he let her take it without hesitation. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was Hadwin's. She recognized the cramped, slightly backward slant of it from the household correspondence she had occasionally reviewed as Edric's promised mate. But the content was not anything she would have expected from a lord's administrative letter. It was addressed to someone named only as the steward of the South Pass, and it spoke in language that was careful without being obscure, of a shipment that had been delayed, of an agreement that was near finalization, and of a complication, that word specifically, complication, that had arisen and would be managed within the week. She was the complication. She read it twice. Then she folded it with hands that were steady, because she made them steady, and said, "What is the South Pass?" "A mountain crossing," Tristan said, "that my kingdom controls access to, or did control, until approximately 4 months ago, when someone began moving through it without authorization." He paused, watching her face. "We traced the irregular passage to Edenmore's territory 3 weeks ago. That is the true reason I came south for the territorial negotiations, not trade agreements." Willa looked at him. Something was arranging itself in her mind with the cold, clicking precision of pieces that had been in the wrong order for months finally finding their correct positions. "Edric knew you were coming to investigate him." "Yes." And he needed to present himself as a loyal, settled lord, a man with a proper mate, an arranged household, nothing irregular. She heard her own voice flatten as she said it. That is why he agreed to the betrothal. Tristan said nothing. He did not confirm it in words. He did not need to. The confirmation was in his eyes, in the quiet sorrow there, not pity, not condescension, but the specific sadness of someone who respects another person enough to let them arrive at the truth without softening it. Willa had been a prop. 8 months of her life, 8 months of telling herself that the cooling warmth was grief and stress, and the difficulty of merging 2 households. All of it had been a performance staged for this, for the arrival of the Alpha King's inspection, for the appearance of normalcy, while something else moved through a mountain pass in the dark. She handed the parchment back. "What is he moving through the pass?" she asked. "We don't know the full extent yet," Tristan said. "Information, possibly materials. There are iron deposits in the southern hills that should not be leaving the kingdom without taxation and record. Possibly people." He paused. "There are 3 packs in the southern reaches that have reported missing members over the past year. Omegas, primarily. Young. Unaffiliated." The words landed with a weight that went beyond herself. Willa had been thinking since the garden wall, primarily about her own danger, about Cohen, about the wreckage of the life she had been building. Now the picture expanded, and it was darker than she had imagined, darker than a man's infidelity, or even a lord's political scheming. "He's selling people," she said. "We believe so. We cannot prove it yet. My dowry." She said it slowly, following the logic. "My mother's estate had property in the southern reaches, 2 parcels near the Garveth Valley. If I died as Edric's mate, before the betrothal was formally dissolved, those properties would revert to his holdings under the inheritance laws of this territory." She paused. Properties near the southern reaches would make excellent staging points for moving people through the hills without going near the main roads. Tristan was watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not surprise, not the patronizing approval of a man who had not expected her to think clearly, but something more genuine than either. A recognition. The specific look of someone who sees another person accurately, perhaps for the first time. "That is exactly our assessment," he said quietly. "Then you need me," Willa said. "The properties are under my family's name. The title documents are held in my mother's estate in Garveth. Edric cannot access them without either my signature or my death." She felt something harden in her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something beneath anger. Something colder and more structural. "If I'm dead, the title transfers automatically under the bereavement laws. If I'm alive and refuse to sign, he has nothing. Which means," Tristan said, "that as long as you are alive and beyond his reach, you are his primary obstacle. And his primary target. Yes, They looked at each other across the dim light of the common room, with the fire settling behind them, and the sound of horses outside, and the morning barely beginning beyond the shuttered windows. "My brother," Willa said. "We sent a rider to the Eastern Academy before dawn," Tristan said. "Discreetly, with a message that will reach the head scholar and ensure Cohen is moved to secure quarters without creating alarm. He will not know the full situation until we can reach him properly, but he will be safe." Willa absorbed this. He had done it already. Without being asked, without making it a bargaining point, without attaching it to any condition. He had simply identified a vulnerability, understood what it meant to her, and addressed it. She did not know what to do with a man who moved like that, with that quiet, unhurried efficiency, as if doing the right thing were simply the natural next step in any situation, requiring no announcement. "Why?" she asked, and it was the same question as last night, carrying the same weight. "Because he's your brother," Tristan said, as if this were entirely sufficient. She looked away. The fire, the rough stone of the hearth, the hanging bundles of dried herbs above the mantel, lavender and rosemary and something that smelled faintly of pine resin. She breathed through the tightness in her chest and thought about what she needed, what was practical, what came next. "I need to get to Garveth," she said. "The estate documents. If we have the title records, we have proof that the properties exist and who holds them. And if we can connect that to the South Pass..." "Willa." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Lady Willa, not the careful formality she would have expected from a man of his standing addressing a woman of hers. Just her name, said plainly, as if they had known each other long enough for that. She looked at him. "Edenmore has riders on every road south," he said. "The Garveth Road passes within 6 miles of Edric's eastern watchtower. You cannot travel it alone." He paused. "I'm going south. My delegation passes through Garveth territory in 2 days. If you travel with us, you travel under the king's protection. No one touches you." She understood what he was offering. She also understood that it was not a simple gift. Accepting the protection of the Alpha King was a statement, a visible alignment, something that would be seen and noted and interpreted by every lord and lady from here to the southern reaches. It would make her a participant in whatever was being built against Edric. It would make her a target of a different, more open kind. It would also make her the most protected woman in the territory. She thought about Cohen's letter against her skin. She thought about her mother's estate, the title documents, the 2 young parcels of land near Garveth Valley that she had inherited at 19, and had never thought much about until tonight. She thought about missing omegas and mountain passes, and a man who had moved iron in the dark, while she had sat at his betrothed's table trying to convince herself that the cooling warmth was just grief. "Do you always offer protection to women you find running through forests?" she asked. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close to one. "No," he said. "I don't." She looked at him for a long moment. At the steadiness of him, the unhurried patience, the way he stood without performing anything, without performing authority or warmth or interest, simply being all of those things in a way that required no announcement. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me," he said, and she did. Her conditions were 3. First, she would not be managed. She would be informed of every development in the investigation as it occurred, not summarized afterward, not softened for her benefit. She was not a guest to be kept comfortable while men made decisions around her. She was a participant. Second, when the time came to present the title documents and the evidence against Edric before whatever council or court Tristan convened, she would speak for herself. No representative, no proxy, no alpha, speaking on her behalf while she stood decoratively to the side. Her voice, her words, her testimony. Third, Whatever happened with the investigation, Cohen would be brought south to join her before any public proceeding. She would not stand in a council chamber alone. Tristan had listened to all three without interrupting, without the slight impatient tension she had come to recognize in men who tolerated a woman's conditions the way they tolerated rain, as an inconvenience to be endured before the actual weather returned. He had simply listened, and then said, "Agreed," to each one, without qualification or amendment. That had been 2 days ago. The journey south moved with the measured efficiency of a king's delegation. Not fast, but steady, covering ground without waste. Willa rode near the center of the group on a gray mare that Petra had selected for her, with the practical eye of someone who knew horses and knew that what a rider needed after a difficult night was a mount that required very little argument. The mare was steady and warm, and had the particular virtue of not requiring constant management, which left Willa's attention free. She used it to watch Tristan. She was honest with herself about this, at least privately. She watched him the way she might study any significant unknown, carefully, systematically, without allowing herself to attach meaning to what she observed before she had enough information. He rode at the front of the column most of the time, speaking with his men in a low, unhurried way that she gradually recognized as his natural register. He did not raise his voice for emphasis or effect. When something required emphasis, he went quieter, and the people around him leaned in. She had never seen it fail. On the second afternoon, he fell back to ride beside her. He did not announce it or make it a moment. He simply brought his horse alongside hers on the wider stretch of the road, where the trees thinned and the valley opened below them, pale gold in the autumn light, and rode in silence for a while, as if this were entirely ordinary. "Tell me about the estate," he said eventually. "Garveth. What it was like when your mother was alive." She glanced at him. It was an unexpected question. Practical information would have been more obvious. The layout of the building, the location of the document room, the names of any remaining servants. Instead, he had asked about her mother. She answered anyway, because the question had opened something she had not known was closed. The Garveth estate had been small by noble standards, a modest stone house at the edge of a working valley, more farm than manor, with a kitchen garden that her mother had tended herself every spring, and an old apple orchard that produced fruit too tart for most people's taste, and perfect for her mother's specific recipe for harvest cake. Her mother had been a woman of particular quiet competences. She could read contracts in 3 languages, ride without a saddle, set a broken bone in a pinch and had done so twice, and made the best harvest cake Willa had ever tasted. She had also been very good at dying, which was to say she had done it with the same self-possessed efficiency she brought to everything, making sure the title documents were properly recorded and the estate debts were settled, and her daughter understood exactly what she was inheriting before she let herself go. Willa had been 19. She had held her mother's hand and felt the moment it went still, and had then spent the next 3 hours reviewing the estate records because her mother had asked her to, and because it was easier than stopping. She did not tell Tristan all of this. She told him the shape of it, the outline, the parts that explained the estate's layout and the document room's location, but something in his attention made the telling fuller than she intended. He listened with the quality of someone who was hearing not just information, but history. Not just facts, but the specific gravity of a life. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," he said, when she had finished. "She was," Willa said, simply, without elaboration. Some things did not need more than that. They rode in silence for a while. Below them, the valley road curved toward the first visible edge of Garveth territory. The old boundary stones her mother had maintained meticulously, carved with the family mark. Willa recognized them from 50 yards away and felt something tighten in her chest that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Last night Petra mentioned the mate bond." She kept her voice level. She didn't say much. I don't think she meant to say anything at all, actually. But she used the word in a specific way. And then she stopped. And there was a quality to how she stopped that told me she had said more than she intended. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man deciding something. "What did she say exactly?" he asked. She said, "The king doesn't usually..." And then she stopped and redirected. Willa looked at him steadily. "The king doesn't usually what?" He met her eyes. The afternoon light was behind him, catching the gray of his gaze, and she had the disorienting sense, not for the first time, that his eyes were older than his face, carrying a kind of long patience that did not come from temperament but from experience, from having watched things carefully for a very long time. "The king doesn't usually ride back to find someone after passing them on a road," he said. Willa had suspected something like this. Suspecting it and hearing it stated plainly were different things. "You felt something," she said. "In the forest." "Yes. The mate bond. I don't know yet what it is." He said it with the same careful honesty he brought to everything, not dramatic, not evasive. "I know that I turned around on that road when every practical reason said to continue. I know that I have not been able to determine a purely strategic explanation for several of the decisions I have made in the last 48 hours. A pause. "I thought you should know that, because I said I would not manage you, and keeping that information from you would be a form of management." Willa looked at the valley below them, the boundary stones, the old apple orchard just visible at the estate's edge, dark branches against the pale sky. She had heard of the mate bond all her life. Everyone in the shifter world had, whether or not they carried wolf blood themselves. She had heard it described as inevitable, as overwhelming, as something that removed choice from the equation entirely. She had also, in the last 8 months, heard a man tell her she was cherished and important, and exactly what he had been looking for, and she had believed him, and she had been wrong in a way that had nearly killed her. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me," he said. It was becoming a pattern between them, the same invitation, open and undemanding. "Whatever you felt on that road," she said, "I am not ready to feel it back. I may not be capable of it yet. I don't know if I'm capable of trusting that kind of thing in any man right now, let alone..." She stopped. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need time to be a person before I consider being anyone's mate. I need to finish this. I need to see Edric and Hadwin held accountable. I need to know Cohen is safe. I need to stand in that document room and hold my mother's title records in my hands, and know that no one can use them against her memory." Her jaw tightened. "After all of that, I will know better what I'm capable of." Tristan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That is entirely reasonable." She looked at him, searching for the caveat, the but, the gentle redirection toward what he needed from her. There was none. "Do you have a mate?" she asked. The question came out differently than she planned, softer, more direct, with an honesty that surprised her. He looked at her with those gray eyes, steady and undeflected. "Not yet," he said, and something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, without urgency, as if not yet were simply a description of the present moment rather than a wound, made the tightness in her chest shift into something she did not immediately have a name for. She looked away first. The Garveth estate was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was larger, not in height, but in the way a person grows around their losses, filling the space where smaller versions of themselves once fit. The stone was the same, gray-brown and moss-touched at the foundations. The kitchen garden was overgrown. The apple trees had not been pruned in years and had gone shaggy and wild, branches crossing each other at odd angles, but they were heavy with fruit. Petra and 2 of Tristan's men secured the building in 20 minutes. It had been empty since the remaining servants had dispersed after Willa left for Edenmore, and there was no resistance, only dust and cold hearths, and the particular sadness of a house that had been waiting. The document room was where her mother had left it. Third door on the left, off the main corridor, a small room with a writing table and shelves of bound ledgers and a locked iron box behind the leftmost shelf that required a key Willa had worn on a cord around her neck since she was 19 years old. She opened the box herself, alone, while Tristan waited in the corridor without being asked to. Inside were the title documents, 3 parcels of land, her mother's seal, the original survey records, and a folded letter in her mother's handwriting that she had not known was there, addressed simply to W, sealed with red wax. She did not open it yet. She pressed it flat against her palm for a moment, feeling the wax seal, the familiar weight of her mother's handwriting visible through the fold. Then she picked up the title documents, carried them to the writing table, and began to read. The Garveth parcels were exactly where she remembered. 2 in the valley, 1 on the eastern slope, the slope that faced the South Pass. The slope that would provide, she saw immediately with the cold clarity of someone reading a map for what it actually said rather than what she wished it said, a clear sightline to the mountain crossing. Not just a staging point, a watchtower position. Whoever held that parcel could monitor every movement through the pass. Her mother had owned it. She had inherited it. Edric had wanted it. She brought the documents out to Tristan. He read them without speaking. Then he called Petra and 2 others, and gave instructions in a low, rapid voice that carried the particular quality of a plan, moving from theory into execution. Within the hour, riders were dispatched, 1 north to the capital, 1 east toward the academy with an updated message for Cohen, 1 west to the lord of the neighboring territory, who Tristan had apparently already identified as a reliable witness for what was coming. The council convenes in 6 days, Tristan told her, when the riders were gone. At the neutral ground of Thornwall Keep, Edric and Hadwin will be summoned as parties to a territorial investigation. They won't know what evidence we have until they're already there. And the missing Omegas? Willa asked. We have names now. Locations we're moving on tonight. His jaw was tight. Some of them are still in the territory. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I want to be there, she said, at Thornwall, when they face the council. You will be, he said. You're the first witness. That night, for the first time and she could not remember how long, Willa sat beside a fire that was actually warm and read her mother's letter. It was short. Her mother had always preferred precision to length. It said, "The land on the eastern slope is the most valuable thing I owned, not for what it's worth, but for what it sees. Keep it. Don't let anyone tell you it's just dirt. Dirt that watches a mountain pass is something else entirely. You'll know when it matters. You always do." She folded it carefully and put it with Cohen's letter, against her heart. Thornwall Keep was built on neutral ground for exactly the reason its name suggested. It was a wall between things, a place where disputes came to be settled rather than fought. The great council chamber had high stone ceilings and narrow windows that let in cold northern light, and the lords who filled the long benches on either side of the central aisle had the careful, watchful quality of men who understood that what happened in this room would be recorded and remembered. Willa walked in first. She had borrowed a gown from Petra, deep gray wool, clean and well-fitted, with no ornamentation. She had braided her own hair. She carried the title documents in a leather folio under her arm, and her mother's letter folded inside her bodice beside Cohen's, and she walked to the witness position at the front of the chamber without looking at the 2 men already seated to the left of the central aisle. She looked at them once she had arrived. She made herself do it deliberately, as a choice rather than an accident. Edric looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was the same height, the same broad shoulders, the same careful grooming. But there was something diminished about him. The quality of a man who has spent several days understanding that his calculations have failed and has not yet located a new posture to replace the old confidence. He met her eyes for a moment and then looked away. Hadwin did not look away. He watched her with the flat assessment she remembered from the garden bench, and she looked back at him steadily until he was the one who moved. The council proceedings took most of the morning. Tristan presided with the same composure he brought to everything, asking questions in that quiet voice that made the chamber lean forward, presenting evidence with the methodical patience of someone who had spent weeks building something that would not fall apart under scrutiny. The riders who had intercepted the midnight messenger from Edenmore testified. The lord of the neighboring territory testified about irregular movements through his lands. 2 of Tristan's senior men presented the records of unauthorized South Pass crossings, the dates, the volumes, the patterns. Then Tristan said, "Lady Willa of Garveth." She stood. She spoke for 20 minutes. She did not rush, and she did not soften. She described the betrothal, the 8 months at Edenmore, the cooling of Edric's attention, and what she had told herself about it. She described finding him with Safine, and what his face had looked like when he turned, that particular expression of inconvenience. And several of the lords shifted in their seats at that. She described the garden, Hadwin's voice, an accident, the forest at night. These things happen. She saw Hadwin's jaw tighten as she repeated his words back to the council, precisely, without embellishment. She presented the title documents, explained the Eastern Slope parcel, explained what her mother's letter had said about what that land could see. She said, "My mother left me that land because she understood its value. Lord Edric wanted my death because he understood it too. The difference between them was that my mother wanted me to keep it, and Lord Edric wanted me gone so he could take it." The chamber was very quiet when she sat down. The council deliberated for 2 hours. The verdict was not a surprise to anyone in the room, but it still carried the particular weight of things that are named publicly after being hidden privately. Edric was stripped of his lordship and his territorial rights, his lands to be held in trust, pending full investigation of the South Pass activities. Hadwin was remanded to the capital for formal proceedings on conspiracy charges. The South Pass operation was to be dismantled immediately, with Tristan's forces providing the enforcement. Regarding the missing Omegas, 7 had already been recovered from a holding point in the southern hills by Tristan's men the night before the council. 3 more were located within the week. Their families were notified. Their names were recorded. None of it was enough, and everyone in the room knew it, and the knowing sat heavily in the air alongside the verdict, like 2 things that had to coexist without resolution. Willa did not feel triumph when it was over. She felt something quieter and more durable, the specific relief of a structure that has been wrongly weighted finally being set level. Not happiness, correctness. The world arranged the way it was supposed to be arranged. Cohen arrived the following morning. He came into the anteroom where Willa was waiting with the contained urgency of someone who had been frightened for days and was now converting the fear retroactively into motion, and he crossed the room in 4 steps and put his arms around her with the uncomplicated fierceness of a younger brother who had always been better at saying things with his body than with words. She held on for a long time. He was taller than she remembered, or she had forgotten, or both. "You should have written to me sooner," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I would have come." "I know that too." He pulled back and looked at her face with the careful attention he had always given her, reading her the way he read everything, thoroughly, without rushing. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension went out of his shoulders. "The king," he said in a different tone. "Is a good man," she said simply. Cohen looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, with the particular economy of someone who has asked a question with 6 words and received a complete answer. That evening, Tristan found her in the keep's small inner garden, a sheltered courtyard with a stone bench and a dormant rose arbor, the canes bare and tangled against the old wood frame. She was sitting on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, watching the last of the daylight leave the sky. He sat beside her, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be present. They were quiet for a while. "The Eastern Slope parcel," she said eventually. "I've been thinking about what to do with it. And I want to establish a way station there for unaffiliated Omegas, packs that have no alpha protection, families that are between territories. Somewhere safe to stay, properly resourced, with people who are paid fairly and treated well." She paused. "My mother would have liked that." "It's a good use of land that watches a mountain pass," he said. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, with those steady gray eyes, patient and unhurried, as he always was. "I'm not the same person who ran through that forest," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're more." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had stepped aside on a dark path, who had brought her soup and kept his word on every condition, and protected her brother, and waited without pressing, who had said not yet with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that some things could only be built slowly, from honest materials, without shortcuts. She reached over and took his hand. It was a small thing. A beginning, not an ending, but a beginning made with full knowledge, with both eyes open, with the weight of everything she had survived informing the choice rather than obscuring it. He closed his fingers around hers, gently, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Cohen remained in Garveth, eventually taking over management of the Valley Estate and the Way Station project with the organized enthusiasm of someone who had found the work he was meant to do. The Way Station on the Eastern Slope opened the following spring and served 17 families in its first season. Marta arrived 3 weeks after the council, having traveled alone from Edenmore with 2 bags and the expression of someone who had simply decided it was time, and she became the Way Station's first head keeper, which surprised no one who knew her. Edric was never a lord again. He lived out his years quietly in diminished circumstances, which was, Willa decided, a more honest fate than a dramatic one. Hadwin was tried formally at the capital. The verdict was exile. Willa and Tristan were mated in a ceremony at Thornwall Keep the following autumn, on a gray morning with the smell of wood smoke and coming rain. With Cohen beside her and Petra standing witness, and the mountain pass visible in the far distance through a gap in the clouds. She wore her mother's ring on her finger. It fit now, or close enough that it didn't matter. When the officiant asked if she came to this freely and without compulsion, she said yes, without hesitation, and meant it with the full weight of someone who understood, now, exactly what that word required. She was 30 years old. She had survived a false betrothal, a conspiracy, a midnight flight through a forest, and a council chamber. She had built something from the wreckage and found someone who had helped her carry the beams without once suggesting he should hold them instead of her. She was not the woman who had stood at that window in a blue gown, telling herself the cooling warmth was just grief. She was someone else now, someone more, and she had chosen every step of it.